Welcome back to the Verified Fears family. They say small towns are where neighbors become family, where everyone knows your name, and where nothing ever happens. But what if I told you that behind those white picket fences and friendly waves, some communities harbor secrets so twisted that isolation becomes a prison? Tonight, I'm taking you inside a town where trust is weaponized and escape is impossible. The question isn't whether you'll believe what you're about to hear. It's whether you'll ever feel safe in a small town again. I watched the new family move into the Hartwell place on a Thursday morning in late September. Their U-Haul truck grinding up Mill Creek Road like a dying animal. There was something wrong about the timing. Everyone knew the Hartwell house had been empty for 3 years since old Marceline disappeared, and nobody moved to Millbrook in September when the leaves were already turning and winter was crawling up from the valleys. But there they were, a young couple with a little girl who couldn't have been more than 5, unloading boxes and furniture while the whole town watched from behind their curtains, whispering about why anyone would choose to live in a place where the last resident had vanished without a trace. My name is Meredith, and I'd been the town librarian for 8 years, which in Millbrook made me practically an institution. The library sat at the corner of Main Street and Mill Creek Road, which meant I had a perfect view of the Hartwell place from my desk. And I'd grown accustomed to its empty windows staring back at me like dead eyes. Marceline Hartwell had been one of my regulars, coming in every Tuesday for her romance novels and her weekly dose of gossip, until one Tuesday she simply didn't show up. And by Friday, her neighbor found her front door wide open and her morning coffee still sitting on the kitchen table, stone cold. The police called it a voluntary disappearance, but Marceline was 83 years old with arthritis so bad she could barely walk to her mailbox. So where exactly was she supposed to have gone? The new family introduced themselves that weekend at church. Fletcher and Amanda Morrison, with their daughter Isabella. Fletcher worked remotely in some kind of computer programming. Amanda was a freelance graphic designer. And they'd moved from Portland because they wanted to give Isabella the kind of small-town childhood they'd never had. Reverend Patterson welcomed them warmly, and within minutes they were surrounded by the usual suspects. Fernanda offering to bring them a casserole, Garrett asking if they needed help with any home repairs, and Estella practically interrogating them about their family history. I hung back, watching, because something about their story felt rehearsed, like they'd practiced their answers to questions they knew people would ask. It was 3 weeks later when I first noticed the pattern. Every Tuesday afternoon around 2 o'clock, Amanda would drive down Mill Creek Road toward the old industrial district, where nothing existed except abandoned warehouses and the defunct paper mill. She'd be gone for exactly 2 hours, returning just before Isabella got home from school. And she always carried the same small black duffel bag with her. At first, I thought maybe she'd found some kind of art studio space down there. Plenty of artists in bigger cities converted old warehouse spaces. But when I casually asked her about it at the grocery store, her face went completely blank for a moment before she smiled and said she was just exploring the area, getting familiar with the town's history. The lie sat wrong with me, especially when I realized her Tuesday trips coincided exactly with Marceline's old library visits. Millbrook was a town of routines, and people didn't just happen into the same schedule as someone who'd mysteriously disappeared. I started paying closer attention, noting that Fletcher seemed genuinely surprised when Amanda mentioned these trips, and that Isabella never seemed to know where her mother went on Tuesday afternoons. Children always know their parents' schedules, even when they pretend not to care. But Isabella would just shrug when other kids asked why her mom drove toward the scary old buildings every week. One Tuesday in November, curiosity finally got the better of me. and I closed the library early to follow Amanda's route. I stayed far back, watching her small silver sedan navigate the potholes and broken pavement until she pulled up to what had once been the mill's administrative building. The structure was solid brick, built to last. But the windows were boarded up, and the parking lot was cracked with weeds pushing through like broken teeth. Amanda sat in her car for nearly 10 minutes, and I was beginning to think she was having second thoughts about whatever she came there to do, when another car pulled up beside her. An old blue pickup truck that I recognized as belonging to Saul Hendricks, the town's hardware store owner. Saul was a man I'd known for years, someone who helped everyone fix their porches and unclog their gutters, someone who sponsored the Little League team and never missed a church service. But watching him get out of his truck and approach Amanda's car with that same black duffel bag in his hands made my blood turn to ice water. They exchanged bags through their car windows like a drug deal, the whole transaction lasting maybe 30 seconds. And then Saul drove away, while Amanda sat there for another hour, just staring at the abandoned building. I followed her home, my hands shaking on the steering wheel as I tried to process what I'd seen. Back at the library, I started researching the old mill property, digging through property records and historical documents. But everything seemed normal, until I found the original construction permits from 1952. The mill had been built on land that was previously the site of Millbrook's first cemetery, established in 1847 but relocated in 1951 to make room for industrial development. According to the records, 347 graves had been moved to the new cemetery on the hill. But there were handwritten notes in the margins indicating that 23 graves couldn't be relocated due to ground conditions and structural complications. The math was simple and horrible. 23 bodies had been left under the mill, paved over and forgotten. And now Amanda and Saul were meeting there every Tuesday with mysterious packages. I spent the next week researching the other people in town who might be connected, cross-referencing Tuesday schedules and unexplained absences. And the pattern that emerged made me wish I'd never started looking. Garrett Wheeler, our helpful handyman, closed his shop every Tuesday from 2 to 4. Fernanda, our friendly neighbor, always had her weekly grocery shopping done by noon on Tuesdays. Estella, our town gossip, never answered her phone on Tuesday afternoons. The following Tuesday, I parked at the tree line near the mill and waited with binoculars, watching as car after car pulled into that broken parking lot. Amanda arrived first, then Saul, then Garrett, then Fernanda, then Estella. And finally 6 other people I recognized from church and the grocery store and the gas station. They gathered in a circle in the shadow of the abandoned building, each carrying an identical black duffel bag. And when they opened those bags and began pulling out items that glinted silver in the afternoon light, I understood with crystal clarity why Marceline Hartwell had disappeared. They weren't just meeting on the site of forgotten graves. They were feeding them. The silver objects were knives and tools, and from each duffel bag came packages wrapped in butcher paper that left dark stains on the broken concrete. They worked methodically, efficiently, like people who had done this many times before. Digging holes in the soft earth between the building's foundation stones and burying their offerings while chanting words I couldn't quite hear, but somehow felt in my bones. When they finished their ritual and began to leave, I realized with growing horror that they weren't just keeping the buried dead fed. They were recruiting new members. Amanda wasn't a newcomer who'd stumbled into this group. She was their newest hunter, trained and initiated. And Fletcher's confusion about her Tuesday trips wasn't ignorance, but carefully planned deception. The Morrison family hadn't moved to Millbrook for a quiet life. They'd been sent here to replace someone who could no longer fulfill their obligations, I drove home through streets that suddenly felt like a trap, past neighbors who waved and smiled while knowing exactly what happened to people who asked too many questions. Marceline hadn't disappeared voluntarily. She'd discovered the truth about the Tuesday group and become their most recent offering to whatever hungry things lay beneath the mill's foundation. Now I was the one asking questions, the one poking into schedules and following cars and researching property records, which meant I was about to become their next problem to solve. That night, I packed a bag and wrote letters to my sister in California. But when I went to my car in the morning, all 4 tires had been slashed, and Amanda Morrison was standing in my driveway with a shovel in her hands and that same practice smile she'd worn at church. Behind her, Fletcher was loading a black duffel bag into their sedan, and little Isabella was watching from the back seat with eyes that looked far too old for her 5-year-old face. Amanda stepped closer, and I could see dried blood under her fingernails, and she said, in the most neighborly voice imaginable, "The library's closed on Tuesdays now, isn't it, Meredith? We thought you might like to see where all the old books go when they're not needed anymore." Working the night shift at Crevon's Gas and Go wasn't supposed to be permanent, just something to pay rent while I figured out what to do with my life after college. My name is Diana, and I'd been manning the register from midnight to 8 a.m. for 6 months, watching truckers fuel up on their cross-country hauls and selling energy drinks to insomniacs who couldn't sleep. The job was quiet, predictable, and mind-numbingly boring, exactly what I thought I needed after 4 years of academic stress. What I didn't expect was to discover that some of those truckers weren't hauling cargo at all. Crevon sat at the intersection of Highway 19 and County Route 47, one of those middle-of-nowhere stops where the nearest town was 15 miles in any direction, and the only light for miles came from our fluorescent signs. During my shifts, I'd see maybe 20 customers total, mostly long-haul drivers who knew our pump stayed on all night and our coffee was fresh. They were usually friendly enough, tired men with weathered faces who'd nod politely while buying cigarettes and asking about road conditions ahead. I learned to recognize the regulars. Jamari, who drove for a produce company out of California. Scott, who transported construction equipment. Lionel, who always bought the same brand of beef jerky and complained about his dispatcher. It was a Tuesday night in March when I first noticed something odd about the delivery schedule. 3 trucks had pulled in within 10 minutes of each other, which wasn't unusual during busy travel times. But what struck me was that they all parked in the back lot instead of near the pumps. I could see them through the security monitor, big 18-wheelers with unmarked trailers, their drivers standing in a small circle near the loading dock behind our building. They talked for maybe 5 minutes. Then one of them walked over to unlock his trailer while the others backed their trucks up close, forming a kind of barrier that blocked my view of whatever they were doing. I told myself it was probably just drivers sharing supplies or trading routes, maybe splitting fuel costs or exchanging paperwork. Truckers had their own culture and their own ways of doing business, and I wasn't about to go poking around in affairs that didn't concern me. But when the same pattern repeated the following Tuesday, different trucks, same procedure, same secretive positioning, curiosity started eating at me like acid. The 3rd Tuesday, I decided to step outside for a cigarette break during their meeting, just to get a better sense of what was happening in our back lot. The March air was sharp and clean, carrying the diesel fumes and distant highway sounds that had become the soundtrack to my nights. I positioned myself near the dumpster where I could see the trucks without being obvious about it, lighting up and pretending to check my phone while watching the drivers work. What I saw made my cigarette fall from my lips and smolder on the asphalt. They weren't transferring cargo or sharing supplies, they were moving bodies. The drivers worked efficiently, like people who'd done this many times before, lifting heavy black bags from one trailer and loading them into another. The bags were clearly body-shaped, and they handled them with the careful reverence of people who knew exactly what they contained. I counted 6 bags total, passed from truck to truck in a relay that took less than 15 minutes. And when they finished, one of the drivers pulled out a small notebook and made what looked like inventory marks, while the others cleaned their hands with industrial wipes. I stubbed out my cigarette and went back inside before they could notice me watching, my hands shaking as I tried to process what I'd witnessed. These weren't accidents or medical transports. There was nothing official or legal about the way they operated, nothing that explained why they'd chosen our isolated gas station as their meeting point. I spent the rest of my shift trying to convince myself I'd misunderstood what I'd seen, that the bags contained something innocent like mannequins or industrial equipment. But the methodical way they'd handled those bundles kept replaying in my mind like a horror movie I couldn't turn off. The next morning, I called in sick and drove to the county sheriff's office. But when I tried to explain what I'd witnessed, Deputy Garrett Wheeler just smiled and told me I'd probably seen drivers transferring legitimate freight. Garrett was someone I'd known since high school, someone who bought coffee from our station twice a week and always asked about my family. So his dismissive attitude felt wrong in a way that made my skin crawl. He suggested I was working too many night shifts and maybe seeing things that weren't really there. And when I pressed him about investigating the Tuesday meetings, he laughed and said truckers had been using our backlot for decades to handle their business. That's when I realized Garrett's patrol route included Highway 19, which meant he drove past Crevons every single night during my shift. If trucks were meeting regularly in our backlot to transfer mysterious cargo, there was no way he hadn't noticed. No way he didn't know exactly what was happening on Tuesday nights. His casual dismissal wasn't ignorance. It was complicity. And suddenly, I understood why those drivers felt safe enough to conduct their business at our station week after week. I started paying closer attention to the other regular customers, looking for signs of who else might be involved in whatever network I'd stumbled into. Alan, who managed the truck stop diner across the highway, always closed early on Tuesday nights. Zachariah, who ran the auto parts store in town, had mentioned several times that he got his best deals on used parts from out-of-state suppliers, who delivered directly to him. Ford, the funeral director from the next county over, had been coming in for cigarettes every Wednesday morning for months, always looking tired like he'd been working all night. The pattern was becoming clear. I was surrounded by people who were either actively participating in or deliberately ignoring a body disposal network that stretched across multiple counties. Our gas station wasn't just a convenient meeting point. It was a crucial hub in an operation that moved human remains like freight. And I was the night shift clerk who'd accidentally discovered their schedule. 3 weeks later, I made the mistake of trying to document what I was seeing, setting up my phone to record through the window while the trucks conducted their Tuesday business. The video was grainy and dark, but it clearly showed the transfer of body-shaped bundles, and I thought finally I'd have evidence that even Garrett couldn't dismiss. I was so focused on getting good footage that I didn't notice Cassius, one of the regular drivers, watching me from inside the store until I turned around and found him standing directly behind me. Cassius was a man I'd served dozens of times, someone who always paid in cash and never made small talk. But seeing him in the empty store at 2 a.m. with that knowing smile on his face made my blood freeze. He asked if I was enjoying the show, and when I tried to pretend I didn't know what he meant, he walked over to the register and started counting the bills in the cash drawer like he owned the place. He told me that curious employees were bad for business, that the Tuesday meetings had been running smoothly for 5 years, and that smart people learned to mind their own business if they wanted to keep their jobs. when I threatened to call the police. Cassius laughed and said I should ask Deputy Wheeler how his wife, Ariel, was doing, mentioning that she'd been having such a hard time lately with her depression and her pills. The way he said it made it clear that Ariel's problems weren't natural, that she was being kept dependent and compliant to ensure Garrett's cooperation. And suddenly, I understood that this network had tentacles reaching into every aspect of local law enforcement. I tried to quit the next day, but my manager Zayden told me the owners specifically requested that I stay on the night shift, that they appreciated employees who were reliable and discreet. He handed me a bonus check for $300 and said the company valued loyalty above everything else. And there was something in his tone that made it clear this wasn't a conversation about employment anymore. I was being bought, threatened, and warned all at the same time, and refusing their generosity would mark me as a problem that needed solving. That's when I started noticing how many of our regular customers seemed to know exactly when I worked, how they'd time their visits to coincide with my shifts and make casual conversation about my schedule. Jamari would ask if I was working the following Tuesday. Scott would mention how quiet the roads were at night and how easy it would be for someone to disappear. And Lionel started bringing me coffee and asking about my family, my living situation, whether anyone would miss me if I didn't show up for work. The final piece clicked into place when I realized that every Tuesday, exactly 24 hours after the truck meetings, Ford, the funeral director, would stop by for cigarettes and mention how busy he'd been lately, how many transfers he'd handled from out-of-state facilities. The network wasn't just moving bodies. They were providing them to funeral homes that asked no questions, probably filling unmarked graves or cremating remains that had never been properly identified. Last Tuesday, I decided to document everything in a letter to the state police, detailing names, license plates, and the exact timing of the operation. I hid the letter in my car and went to work like normal. But when the trucks arrived at their usual time, Cassius came inside and told me the owners wanted to meet with me personally to discuss my future with the company. He said they had a special delivery truck waiting outside, and that I should consider it an opportunity for advancement, a chance to see how the real business operated. Through the window, I could see the truck he was talking about. And for the first time, its trailer doors were standing open, revealing an interior that looked more like a mobile processing facility than cargo space. There were metal tables with restraints, plastic sheeting covering the walls, and industrial equipment I couldn't identify, but knew I never wanted to experience firsthand. Cassius walked closer and said they'd been watching me for months, evaluating my suitability for a more active role in their operation, and that tonight was my final interview. He explained that everyone starts somewhere in their network. Some people drove trucks, some people cleaned up messes, some people disposed of evidence, and some people became evidence themselves when they proved unsuitable for other roles. I'm writing this from the store's bathroom, the only place I could lock the door and buy myself a few minutes to think. Cassius is waiting outside, and I can see more trucks pulling into the back lot than I've ever seen before. Their drivers gathering for what I now understand is my induction ceremony. The network has decided I know too much to live, but might be useful enough to join. And either way, I won't be working the night shift at Crevon's Gas and Go much longer. If you find this, know that Highway 19 isn't safe, that the truckers aren't all hauling legitimate cargo, and that some small-town gas stations serve purposes darker than selling fuel and coffee to travelers who just want to make it safely to their destinations. The first time I noticed something wrong with Calliope next door, she was standing in her garden at 3 a.m, methodically watering her roses with what looked like liquid silver in the moonlight. My name is Callie, and I'd been living in the same house on Maple Street for 12 years watching neighbors come and go with the predictable rhythm of small-town life. But Calliope had moved in 6 months ago, and nothing about her felt predictable or safe, even though everyone else seemed to think she was the perfect addition to our quiet neighborhood. She was the kind of neighbor who brought homemade cookies to block parties and always volunteered to collect mail when people went out of town. The kind of woman who remembered everyone's birthdays and never forgot to compliment their yard work. Calliope was maybe 70 years old, with silver hair she kept in a neat bun and kind eyes that crinkled when she smiled. And within weeks of moving in, she'd become the unofficial grandmother of our street. Children loved her, parents trusted her, and even the teenagers who usually ignored adults would stop to chat with her when they passed her house. But there were small things that didn't add up. Details that nagged at me like splinters under the skin. Her garden bloomed with impossible perfection, even in the dead of winter. Roses and hydrangeas flowering in temperatures that should have killed them months ago. Her house never seemed to have utility bills delivered, never had service trucks in the driveway, never showed the normal signs of maintenance that every other home required. And then there were the sounds at night. Not loud enough to complain about, but persistent enough to wake me several times a week. It sounded like digging, the rhythmic scrape of metal against soil that would start around midnight and continue until dawn. I'd stand at my bedroom window, peering through the darkness toward her backyard. But I could never see exactly what she was doing behind the tall privacy fence she'd installed her first week there. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of movement, the shadow of someone working methodically in the garden beds. But whenever I tried to get a better view, the sounds would stop abruptly, as if she knew she was being watched. The children on our street started disappearing their pets first, small things that people attributed to natural causes or accidents. Mariam's cat stopped coming home. Then Angel's rabbit died suddenly despite being perfectly healthy the day before. Scott's family lost their dog to what the vet called kidney failure, though the animal had shown no symptoms of illness. Within 2 months, nearly every family on the block had experienced some kind of pet loss. And while people mourned and replaced their animals, no one seemed to connect the pattern or question the timing. I started paying closer attention to Calliope's daily routine, noting that she always did her gardening early in the morning before most people were awake, and that she frequently carried small bundles wrapped in brown paper from her house to various spots around her yard. She told people she was composting kitchen scraps and planting seasonal bulbs, but the bundles were always the same size and shape, roughly the dimensions of a shoebox, and she buried them with the careful precision of someone following a specific ritual rather than random gardening. One morning in November, I decided to take my coffee outside and do some casual yard work of my own, positioning myself where I could observe Calliope's morning routine without being obvious about it. She emerged from her house at exactly 6:30, carrying her familiar brown bundle and a small gardening spade, and I watched her walk directly to the rose bed along our shared property line. What I saw her unbury from that spot made my coffee mug slip from my hands and shatter on the sidewalk. It was a collar, small and blue with a silver bell, that I recognized immediately as belonging to Angel's rabbit. Calliope examined it carefully, wiping off the soil with a cloth, then placed it in a plastic bag before burying her fresh bundle in the same hole. She worked efficiently, covering her tracks and smoothing the soil until no one would ever suspect the ground had been disturbed. And when she finished, she stood and waved pleasantly at me like we were just two neighbors enjoying the morning air. That afternoon, I called Amanda, who lived 2 houses down and had lost her hamster the previous month, and asked her to describe the pet's collar and toys. When she mentioned a small blue collar with a bell, identical to what I'd seen Calliope handle, my suspicions crystallized into certainty. Our sweet, helpful neighbor wasn't just coincidentally present during our pet losses. She was actively collecting them. And the bundles she buried were the animals themselves, part of some systematic process that none of us understood. I started documenting everything: the timing of her garden work, the locations where she buried her bundles, the correlation between her activities and the pet deaths that followed. The pattern was methodical and deliberate, suggesting that Calliope wasn't acting randomly or impulsively, but following some kind of predetermined schedule. Every 2 weeks, she would select a new animal from the neighborhood, and within days, that pet would sicken and die while she prepared a fresh burial site in her garden. When I tried to share my observations with other neighbors, their reactions ranged from dismissive to concerned about my mental state. Lionel suggested I was spending too much time alone and letting my imagination run wild, while Ariel pointed out that Calliope had been nothing but kind and helpful to everyone on the block. Even when I mentioned the timing of the pet deaths, people attributed them to coincidence or seasonal factors, and several neighbors suggested I should get to know Calliope better before making unfounded accusations. But Isabella, who lived next door on the other side of Calliope's house, privately told me she'd noticed strange smells coming from the woman's basement windows, especially during the early morning hours when she did her gardening. The odor was chemical and organic at the same time, like a mixture of cleaning supplies and decay. And it was strongest on the days after Calliope buried one of her mysterious bundles. Isabella had also seen her neighbor carrying glass containers up from the basement, jars that looked like they contained liquid and floating objects she couldn't identify. 3 weeks later, my own cat Whiskers began showing signs of illness. The same lethargy and loss of appetite that had preceded the deaths of other neighborhood pets. I rushed him to the veterinarian, but the tests came back inconclusive, showing elevated levels of an unknown compound in his blood that the vet couldn't identify. When I mentioned that other pets in my neighborhood had died with similar symptoms, the vet became serious and suggested I contact animal control about possible poisoning. But by the time I got home, Whiskers was already too weak to stand. That night, I watched from my darkened living room as Calliope emerged from her house with another brown bundle, this one larger than usual. She walked to a section of her garden that she'd never used before, directly under my bedroom window, and began digging with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this many times. As she worked, she hummed softly to herself, a lullaby that sounded familiar until I realized it was the same tune she always hummed when she played with neighborhood children during block parties. When she finished burying her bundle and returned to her house, I waited 20 minutes, then crept outside with a flashlight and small shovel. The soil was still loose and easy to move, and within minutes, I'd uncovered what she'd buried. A glass jar containing what looked like organs suspended in clear liquid, with a handwritten label that simply said, "Whiskers, November 15th. Below that were the words, "Collection 47, written in the same neat handwriting I'd seen on the thank you cards Calliope left when neighbors helped her with groceries or yard work. I replaced the soil and returned to my house, but the implications of what I'd found made sleep impossible. Calliope wasn't just killing neighborhood pets. She was preserving parts of them in jars, maintaining some kind of collection that required regular additions. The number 47 suggested she'd been doing this for far longer than the 6 months she'd lived on our street, which meant she'd either brought existing specimens with her or had been operating in other neighborhoods before moving here. The next morning, I decided to call the police. But when I tried to explain what I'd discovered, the dispatcher treated me like a crank caller. She told me that digging up a neighbor's garden without permission was illegal, and that preserving dead animals wasn't necessarily a crime unless there was evidence of cruelty or intent to harm humans. When I mentioned the suspicious pet deaths, she said I'd need concrete evidence of poisoning, not just suspicions based on timing and circumstance. That afternoon, Calliope knocked on my door with a plate of fresh cookies and a concerned expression, asking about Whiskers and whether there was anything she could do to help during this difficult time. She spoke with genuine warmth and sympathy, the same tone she used with everyone in the neighborhood, but there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. A calculating awareness that suggested she knew exactly what I'd been doing in her garden the previous night. She asked if I'd been sleeping well, mentioning that she'd noticed my lights on at unusual hours and wondering if grief was keeping me awake. When I said I'd been having trouble with nightmares, she offered to make me some herbal tea that would help me sleep more peacefully, reaching into her purse and pulling out a small glass vial filled with dried leaves and flowers. The vial was identical to the ones I'd seen her carrying from her basement. And when she pressed it into my hands, her fingers lingered on mine just long enough to feel wrong. That evening, I poured the tea she'd given me down the sink and called my sister in another state, telling her everything I'd discovered and asking her to call the police if she didn't hear from me within 24 hours. As I was talking, I noticed movement in Calliope's backyard, and when I looked out my kitchen window, I saw her standing at her fence, watching my house with the same patient attention I'd seen her give to her garden work. She raised her hand and waved when she saw me at the window, but instead of the friendly gesture I was used to, this wave felt like a warning or a promise. Later that night, I heard the familiar sounds of digging, but this time they seemed to be coming from directly under my house, as if she was working in the crawl space beneath my foundation. When I woke up this morning, there was a fresh mound of soil in my backyard that I didn't remember being there before, and Whisker's collar was hanging from my mailbox with a note that read, "Thank you for your contribution to the collection." The handwriting was Calliope's, but the paper smelled like the chemical odor Isabella had described coming from her basement windows. I'm writing this because I think I understand now that the neighborhood pets were never the real collection. They were just practice, preparation for something larger and more systematic. Calliope has been studying us, learning our routines and vulnerabilities, determining which of her human neighbors would make the most suitable additions to whatever she's really collecting in those glass jars. And based on the fresh soil in my yard and the fact that my house key no longer seems to work in my front door lock, I suspect I've been selected as collection number 48. My name is April, and for 3 years, I'd served as the curator of the Whitmore County Historical Museum, a small institution housed in what used to be the town's original courthouse from 1847. The building was beautiful in the way old structures can be, with high ceilings and tall windows that let in streams of dusty sunlight. But there had always been something unsettling about the basement storage area where we kept the artifacts that weren't currently on display. People joked that old buildings like ours came with their own ghosts, and I'd grown comfortable dismissing the occasional strange sound or temperature drop as normal quirks of a structure that had witnessed nearly 2 centuries of human drama. Everything changed when the construction crew broke ground for the new wing extension and discovered what the original builders had left buried beneath the museum's foundation. They found them on a Tuesday morning in late October. 23 wooden boxes arranged in a perfect circle around what appeared to be a central stone altar. All of it sealed beneath 6 feet of packed earth and forgotten for over a century and a half. The boxes contained human remains, but not in the way anyone expected. Each skeleton had been carefully disassembled, the bones arranged in precise patterns and wrapped in oiled cloth that had preserved them far better than natural decomposition should have allowed. The construction foreman, Soren, called me down to the excavation site because the workers refused to continue digging until someone official examined what they'd found. Standing in that muddy pit, looking down at the systematic arrangement of bones and artifacts, I felt a cold certainty that we'd uncovered something that was never meant to be disturbed. The stone altar in the center was carved with symbols I didn't recognize, and arranged around it were items that clearly predated European settlement. Pottery shards, metal tools, and what looked like ceremonial objects made from materials I couldn't identify. I called the State Archaeological Department immediately, but when Dr. Armando Fitzgerald arrived the following day to examine the site, his reaction was unlike anything I'd expected from a professional archaeologist. He took photographs and measurements with the efficiency of someone who'd seen similar discoveries before, and when I asked about the significance of the arrangement, he told me quite bluntly that we needed to rebury everything immediately and cancel the construction project. The bones weren't just old graves that had been disturbed. They were part of what he called a binding site, designed to keep something contained rather than to honor the dead. Dr. Fitzgerald explained that indigenous peoples in this region had sometimes created such sites when dealing with entities or forces that couldn't be destroyed, but needed to be confined. The 23 individuals had likely been volunteers, people who'd agreed to serve as eternal guardians, their bones arranged in patterns that would maintain a spiritual barrier around whatever was sealed beneath the central altar. He told me that similar sites had been found in other locations, always with the same warning from local tribal historians. The bones were not to be moved, the arrangement was not to be disturbed, and the central altar was never to be opened. But the county commissioners weren't interested in archaeological warnings or indigenous spiritual practices. They wanted their new museum wing, and they'd already allocated the funding for construction. Despite my protests and Dr. Fitzgerald's official recommendation, they ordered the remains relocated to the town cemetery and the construction to proceed on schedule. The bones were moved on a Friday afternoon in November, loaded into plain wooden boxes and buried in unmarked graves, while a small bulldozer cleared the altar and surrounding area to make room for the foundation work. That weekend, the museum's security system began malfunctioning, triggering false alarms every few hours and recording movement in empty rooms where no one should have been walking. The temperature in the basement storage area dropped by 15 degrees and stayed there despite the heating system working perfectly. And several artifacts that had been stable for decades began showing signs of rapid deterioration. I attributed these problems to construction vibrations and electrical interference from the nearby work site. But Hannah, our part-time assistant, mentioned that she'd started having dreams about people walking through the museum at night, searching for something they'd lost. The dreams weren't just affecting Hannah. Within 2 weeks, half the museum's volunteer staff reported similar nighttime visions of figures wandering through the exhibits, examining displays, and congregating around the entrance to the basement storage area. The figures were always the same: 23 people dressed in clothing from different historical periods, all looking confused and agitated, as if they'd awakened from a long sleep and couldn't understand where they were or why their surroundings had changed so dramatically. I started staying late at the museum to observe these phenomena firsthand, and what I discovered was far more disturbing than simple hauntings or residual energy. The figures weren't ghosts in any traditional sense. They were fully corporeal beings who moved with purpose and intelligence. Examining our exhibits with the curiosity of people who recognized some items but were puzzled by others, they seemed particularly interested in the Native American artifact display, spending long periods studying objects that had been donated to the museum by families who'd found them while farming or hiking in the local hills. One evening in December, I approached one of these figures directly, a woman dressed in clothing from the 1800s, who was standing before a display case containing ceremonial pottery. When she turned to look at me, her eyes held an intelligence and awareness that made it clear she was fully conscious and present. Not some mindless remnant or psychic impression. She spoke in a language I didn't recognize, but her gestures toward the basement stairs and her increasingly agitated tone made her message clear. Something that should have remained buried had been set free, and the museum was now serving as a gateway for forces that the original binding site had been designed to contain. Through a combination of gestures, drawings, and the few English words she seemed to know, the woman communicated that the 23 guardians had awakened because their protective arrangement had been broken. The thing they'd been containing for over 2 centuries was now active again, using the museum as an anchor point while it gathered strength and searched for a way to fully manifest in our world. The guardians were trying to reform their binding circle, but without their bones in the proper arrangement, and without the central altar to focus their power, they could only maintain a tenuous presence that grew weaker each day. I researched the history of the land beneath the museum, digging through county records and oral histories from local families whose ancestors had lived in the area before European settlement. What I found confirmed Dr. Butch Fitzgerald's warnings. The site had been considered sacred and dangerous by multiple indigenous groups, a place where something ancient and malevolent had been imprisoned through great sacrifice and careful ritual. The courthouse had been built on the location deliberately, with the town's founders believing that a government building would provide additional protection through the authority and legitimacy of legal proceedings conducted above the binding site. For over a century, that theory had seemed to work. Whitmore County had experienced normal patterns of crime, accidents, and natural disasters. Nothing that suggested supernatural influences or uncontrolled malevolent forces. But the excavation and removal of the guardian bones had broken the containment system, and now the entity beneath the museum was actively working to free itself completely. The guardians I'd been seeing were the final barrier, their spiritual presence providing temporary resistance against something that grew stronger and more focused with each passing day. The situation became critical when people in town started experiencing what they described as waking nightmares. Episodes where they'd find themselves in their homes or businesses late at night with no memory of how they'd gotten there. Often discovering that they'd written strange symbols on walls or arranged objects in patterns they didn't recognize. These episodes always occurred between midnight and dawn, and they always involved the affected person feeling compelled to walk toward the museum, though most managed to resist the compulsion and return home before reaching our building. Dr. Maximo's Dorhaster Fitzgerald returned to examine the construction site and confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. The excavation hadn't just disturbed the binding circle, it had cracked the stone altar that served as the central focus of the containment system. Something was seeping up from beneath, not physically, but spiritually, influencing the dreams and behaviors of people throughout the county as it tested the boundaries of its prison. The Guardians were fighting a losing battle against an entity that had been waiting nearly 200 years for an opportunity to escape. And their strength was fading as the damaged altar continued to deteriorate. On New Year's Eve, the situation reached a tipping point when the entire town experienced the same shared nightmare. We all found ourselves standing in the museum at midnight, surrounded by the 23 guardians who were clearly struggling to maintain their protective circle around something that writhed and pressed against their weakening barrier. In the dream, we could see the thing they were containing, not its physical form, but its essential nature as hunger and malice given consciousness. a force that viewed human beings as resources to be consumed rather than individuals deserving of life and dignity. The Guardians were pleading with us, trying to communicate that we needed to restore their bones to the proper arrangement and repair the damage to the altar before the entity gained enough strength to break free completely. But they were also warning us that attempting the restoration ritual would require volunteers to take their place. 23 people willing to bind their spirits to the site permanently to maintain the containment for another century or more. I woke from that shared nightmare knowing that our community faced an impossible choice. Sacrifice 23 of our own people to reseal something that should never have been disturbed, or watch as an ancient malevolence gained the freedom to spread beyond our small county and inflict its hunger on a wider world. The Guardians had been trying to protect us all along, but their time was running out, and soon the decision would be made for us by forces beyond our control or understanding. This morning, I found a note pinned to the museum's front door, written in handwriting I didn't recognize, but signed by every member of the town council. It simply said, "We volunteer. Begin the ritual tonight. The children deserve a future free from what we've unleashed." 23 signatures followed, including my own name written in handwriting that looked exactly like mine, but that I had no memory of creating. The Guardians are gathering in the museum basement as I write this, preparing the space for a ceremony that will either save our community or damn us all to join them in their eternal vigil against something that should have remained buried forever. The smell hit me first, even before I saw the trailer park sign half buried in weeds and rust. My name is Amanda, and I'd been driving for 18 hours straight, fleeing from Los Angeles with nothing but a suitcase and the desperate hope that my cousin Zayden might let me crash at his place in Millfield until I figured out what to do next. The GPS had led me down increasingly narrow country roads until I reached this collection of decaying mobile homes arranged in a rough circle around a gravel lot. And the smell that greeted me was a mixture of propane, rotting garbage, and something organic that made my throat close up with revulsion. Zayden's trailer sat at the far end of the park, distinguished from the others only by the bright blue tarp stretched across its roof and the collection of broken appliances scattered around what might generously be called a front yard. I hadn't seen him in 5 years, not since our grandmother's funeral. But desperation makes you overlook a lot of family drama. And I needed somewhere to hide while I figured out how to rebuild my life after discovering my fiancé's gambling debts and the people who'd started showing up at our apartment with very specific threats about payment schedules. When Zayden answered his door, he looked exactly like I'd expected. Thin to the point of being gaunt, with hollow eyes and the kind of nervous energy that comes from too much caffeine and not enough sleep. He welcomed me with genuine warmth, helping me carry my suitcase inside and explaining that he was between jobs, but managing to get by through what he called odd work for some of the other residents. The interior of his trailer was cleaner than I'd expected, though it smelled faintly of chemicals and had the kind of artificial air freshener scent that suggested someone was trying to mask something more unpleasant. Over dinner that first night, Zayden explained the social dynamics of Millfield Acres, describing it as a tight-knit community where people looked out for each other and privacy was respected above all else. Most of the residents were what he called people who needed to be left alone. Folks with complicated pasts or unconventional lifestyles who'd found refuge in this isolated corner of rural county, where the rent was cheap and nobody asked too many questions. He mentioned that the park manager, Cassius, was particularly understanding about late payments and unusual circumstances, though he expected everyone to contribute to the community in some way. The first sign that something was wrong came on my third night, when I woke to the sound of vehicles moving through the gravel lot outside. Through Zayden's thin curtains, I could see headlights circling the trailer park in a slow, methodical pattern. And when I looked closer, I realized the vehicles weren't cars or trucks, but larger commercial vehicles, vans and box trucks that moved with the purposeful efficiency of people conducting business. The convoy stopped at various trailers, spending maybe 10 minutes at each location before moving on to the next. And by dawn, they were gone, without leaving any obvious trace of their activities. When I asked Zayden about the nighttime visitors, his explanation was casual, but somehow unconvincing. He said the park residents sometimes received deliveries or pickups related to their various side businesses. People selling crafts, refurbishing electronics, or dealing in second-hand goods that required flexible scheduling. Most of the residents worked unconventional hours anyway, so nighttime commerce made sense for everyone involved. And the isolated location meant they could operate without disturbing neighbors or attracting unwanted attention from local authorities. But over the next few weeks, I started noticing patterns that didn't align with Zayden's innocent explanations. The nighttime deliveries happened on a precise schedule, always on Tuesdays and Fridays, always involving the same vehicles and the same trailers. The residents who received these visits were never seen during daylight hours, their windows covered with heavy blankets or aluminum foil, and their yards gradually accumulated the kind of debris that suggested abandonment rather than active occupancy. More disturbing was the way other residents reacted when I tried to make casual conversation about the community. Marceline, who lived in the trailer next to Zayden's, would change the subject immediately whenever I mentioned specific neighbors or asked about the nighttime activity. Ford, the park's unofficial handyman, became visibly agitated when I wondered aloud about the chemical smell that seemed to permeate certain areas of the park, suggesting that I was being too curious about things that weren't my business. The truth began revealing itself when I discovered what Zayden was really doing for his odd work around the park. I followed him one afternoon when he said he was helping Estella with some electrical problems. Watching from a distance as he carried several large plastic containers from her trailer to a van parked behind the communal dumpster. The containers were clearly heavy and required careful handling, and when one of them cracked slightly during the transfer, I saw liquid leak out that was thick and dark red, leaving stains on the gravel that looked exactly like dried blood. That evening, I confronted Zayden directly, and his response confirmed what I'd already begun to suspect. The trailer park wasn't just a refuge for people with complicated pasts. It was an active processing facility for a network that dealt in human trafficking and organ harvesting. The residents who never came outside during the day weren't antisocial loners. They were prisoners being held in converted trailers, while buyers were located for their various body parts. The nighttime deliveries weren't bringing supplies or picking up crafts. They were transporting merchandise. Zayden explained this with the detached matter-of-factness of someone who'd become comfortable with horror through gradual exposure. He told me that most of the residents were people like me, individuals fleeing desperate circumstances who'd sought refuge in what appeared to be a safe haven. Cassius, the park manager, specialized in identifying and recruiting people who wouldn't be missed immediately. People whose disappearances could be explained by their desire to start fresh somewhere new. The legitimate residents like Zayden and Marceline provided cover and assistance in exchange for free housing and a cut of the profits. The operation was sophisticated and systematic, with different trailers serving different functions in the process. Some were used for initial processing and medical evaluation, others for storage while buyers were contacted, and a few were equipped as medical facilities where the actual harvesting took place. The isolated location and the community's reputation as a place where people minded their own business meant that screams could be dismissed as domestic disputes, and unusual smells could be attributed to drug manufacturing or other illegal but less horrifying activities. When I asked why he'd brought me there, knowing what would happen to me, Zayden's answer was brutally honest. He said he genuinely cared about me and had hoped I might be willing to join the legitimate residents rather than become inventory. But that decision ultimately belonged to Cassius, who would evaluate my potential usefulness against my market value. Young, healthy people with no immediate family connections were particularly valuable. And my situation, fleeing creditors with no forwarding address, made me an ideal candidate for the harvesting program. That night, I lay awake in Zayden's spare bedroom, listening to the sounds of the Tuesday night delivery convoy and understanding that I was hearing the transportation of people who'd been processed through the same system that was now evaluating me. The vehicles moved with military precision, stopping at designated trailers to collect packages that had once been human beings with names and families and dreams for the future. Some packages would go to medical facilities that asked no questions about the source of their inventory, while others would be delivered to buyers who paid premium prices for fresh organs with guaranteed compatibility. The next morning, Cassius knocked on Zayden's door and introduced himself with the same friendly professionalism I'd seen from legitimate property managers in better neighborhoods. He was a middle-aged man with an honest face and calloused hands, someone who looked like he belonged in overalls rather than expensive surgical scrubs. But his conversation with me made it clear that he was evaluating my physical condition and psychological state with the expertise of someone who'd been in this business for years. He asked about my medical history, my family connections, my reasons for leaving Los Angeles, and whether anyone knew my current location. When I tried to deflect his questions with casual responses, he smiled patiently and explained that he was simply trying to determine how I might best contribute to the community, whether as a working resident or in some other capacity that would benefit everyone involved. The way he said "other capacity" made it clear what he was really discussing, and his tone remained friendly even as he described options that amounted to choosing between becoming a predator or becoming prey. I told him I needed time to think about his offer, and he agreed graciously, mentioning that he understood this was a big decision and that he wanted me to feel comfortable with whatever choice I made. But he also mentioned, almost casually, that the Tuesday and Friday delivery schedules were quite firm, and that people who couldn't commit to being productive community members by the weekend usually found themselves contributing to the community in other ways. Today is Saturday, and I can hear Cassius talking with other residents outside my window, discussing logistics and schedules in the same tone other people might use to plan a neighborhood barbecue. Zayden has been avoiding eye contact with me all morning, and I notice that he's removed all the sharp objects from his kitchen, even the steak knives and can opener. The chemical smell that permeates the park has gotten stronger over the past few days, and I've started recognizing it as the scent of industrial-strength cleaners mixed with the metallic odor of large amounts of blood. I'm writing this because I understand now that there's no escape from Millfield Acres, that the isolated location and the residents' code of silence make it the perfect place for people to disappear without investigation. My cousin brought me here knowing exactly what would happen, and the family loyalty I'd counted on was nothing compared to his need to maintain his position in a community built on systematic murder. The nighttime convoys will come again on Tuesday, and I'll either be helping to load their cargo or I'll become part of it, depending on decisions that are no longer mine to make. If you're reading this, know that some trailer parks serve purposes darker than providing affordable housing, and that family members who invite you to visit isolated communities might be offering you as tribute rather than shelter. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered by a lawyer I'd never heard of from a town I'd never visited. My name is Estella, and until that moment, I'd been living a perfectly ordinary life as a freelance graphic designer in Portland. with no idea that I'd inherited a piece of property from my great-aunt Mariam, whom I'd met exactly once at a family reunion when I was 7 years old. According to the legal documents, I was now the sole owner of the former Millbrook State Hospital, a psychiatric facility that had been abandoned since 1987 and was apparently worth nothing except the land it sat on. The lawyer, Garrett Wheeler, explained over the phone that my great-aunt had purchased the property at a county auction in 1992, with plans to convert it into apartments or condos that never materialized. He said most people who inherited such places either sold them immediately to developers or had them demolished. But there was a clause in the will requiring me to visit the property personally before making any decisions about its future. Mariam had been specific about this requirement, insisting that the new owner needed to understand what they were inheriting before they decided what to do with it. The drive from Portland took 6 hours through increasingly rural countryside, ending at a rusted gate marked with signs warning trespassers about unsafe structures and asbestos contamination. Beyond the gate, a cracked asphalt road led through overgrown grounds to a massive brick building that looked like something from a Victorian nightmare, complete with broken windows, collapsing fire escapes, and vines that had grown through the roof in several places. The main structure was 4 stories tall and stretched for what looked like city blocks, connected to smaller outbuildings by covered walkways that were now mostly fallen timber and twisted metal. I'd brought camping supplies and planned to spend one night on the property to get a sense of what I was dealing with. But standing in front of that abandoned hospital in the late afternoon light, I understood why most people chose to demolish these places rather than try to restore them. The building felt wrong in a way that went beyond simple decay, as if the suffering that had occurred within its walls had somehow become part of the architecture itself, creating an atmosphere of despair that decades of abandonment hadn't been able to erase. Inside, the hospital was even worse than I'd expected, with long corridors lined by rooms that still contained metal bed frames, restraint chairs, and equipment I couldn't identify, but that looked designed to cause pain rather than provide healing. The floors were covered with debris from collapsed ceilings, broken glass from vandalized windows, and what looked like medical records scattered throughout the building like leaves. I picked up some of the papers as I explored, reading treatment notes and patient files that detailed procedures and experiments that seemed more like torture than therapy. What disturbed me most were the personal effects left behind: clothing, shoes, photographs, and letters that suggested patients had lived and died in this place without anyone coming to collect their belongings. In one room, I found a diary written by someone named Fletcher, who described daily life in the hospital during the 1960s, chronicling a system of abuse and neglect that made me understand why facilities like this had eventually been shut down. His entries spoke of patients disappearing in the middle of the night, of treatments that left people permanently damaged, and of staff members who seemed to enjoy the power they had over helpless individuals. As evening approached, I set up my sleeping bag in what had been the hospital's main lobby, figuring it was the most structurally sound area and would give me quick access to the exit if I needed to leave suddenly. I'd brought battery-powered lights and a portable radio, but the building's thick walls seemed to block most signals, leaving me surrounded by silence that felt heavier than normal quiet, as if the air itself was holding its breath. The first signs of activity started around midnight, beginning with sounds that could have been explained by settling wood or shifting debris, but gradually becoming more deliberate and purposeful. I heard footsteps in the corridors above me, the rhythmic pace of someone walking with intention rather than the random creaking I might expect from an old building. Then came what sounded like doors opening and closing, followed by voices that were too distant and muffled to understand, but clearly human in origin. I told myself I was hearing echoes from outside or sounds carried by wind through the broken windows. But when I used my flashlight to investigate the source of the noises, I discovered that I wasn't alone in the building. There were people moving through the hospital's corridors, dozens of them dressed in clothing from different eras, wandering with the aimless shuffle of individuals who had nowhere else to go. They didn't seem to notice my light or react to my presence, but they filled the hallways with a soft murmuring that sounded like conversations held in a language I couldn't understand. Some of the figures looked like patients, wearing hospital gowns and moving with the medicated shuffle described in Fletcher's diary, while others appeared to be staff members in white coats that were stained with substances I didn't want to identify. They moved through the building as if following familiar routines, gathering in what had been treatment rooms, clustering around areas where equipment had once been located, and occasionally stopping to stare at empty spaces as if seeing things that were no longer there. When I tried to approach one of the figures directly, a woman in a nurse's uniform from the 1950s, she turned to look at me with eyes that held intelligence but no recognition, as if she could see me but couldn't process what I represented. She spoke to me in a voice that sounded like it was coming from underwater, asking about medication schedules and patient transfers, treating me like I was part of whatever reality she was experiencing. When I tried to explain that the hospital had been closed for decades, she looked confused and walked away, rejoining the stream of figures that continued their eternal routines. Throughout the night, I witnessed what appeared to be a complete recreation of the hospital's daily operations. With patients being moved from room to room, staff conducting rounds, and activities occurring in spaces that no longer contained the necessary equipment or furniture. The figures weren't ghosts in any traditional sense. They seemed solid and purposeful, going about their business with the efficiency of people who had work to do, even though the institution they served had ceased to exist decades ago. Dawn brought no relief from the supernatural activity, only a shift in the types of routines being performed. The figures began what looked like mourning procedures, gathering patients for meals that would never be served, preparing for treatments that could no longer be administered, and maintaining schedules for an institution that existed only in their collective memory. I realized that these weren't spirits trapped by unfinished business. They were the psychic residue of a place where routine and suffering had become so intertwined that they continued to exist independently of the people who had originally experienced them. By the second night, I understood why Mariam had included the visitation clause in her will. She wanted the new owner to witness what remained of Millbrook State Hospital before deciding its fate. The building wasn't just abandoned. It was actively inhabited by the emotional and psychological imprints of everyone who had lived and died within its walls. Demolition wouldn't solve the problem because the trauma wasn't contained in the bricks and mortar. It was embedded in the location itself, replaying continuously regardless of what physical structures existed there. The final piece of understanding came when I found Mariam's own journal, hidden in what had been the hospital's administrative office. She'd been visiting the property regularly for 30 years, documenting the supernatural activity and trying to understand why the institution's routines continued to repeat themselves. Her research had led her to conclude that places where extreme suffering occurred could become permanently imprinted with the patterns of that suffering, creating loops of activity that would continue until someone found a way to break the cycle. Her final entries described her attempts to communicate with the figures, learning that they were aware of their situation but unable to break free from the routines that had defined their existence. The patients were trapped in endless repetition of their treatment schedules, while the staff continued to perform duties for people who no longer needed their care. Mariam had spent years trying to find a way to release them, but every method she attempted only seemed to strengthen their attachment to the location. On my third night in the hospital, I experienced what Mariam had been working toward: direct communication with the entities that inhabited the building. The woman in the nurse's uniform approached me again, but this time she seemed to recognize me as someone from outside their reality. She explained that they weren't dead in any conventional sense, but were caught in a pattern of behavior that had become more real to them than the external world. She said they wanted to leave, but couldn't break free from the routines that had given their lives meaning, even when those routines no longer served any purpose. I'm writing this from inside Millbrook State Hospital on my 4th day here, and I finally understand what my inheritance really represents. I haven't inherited property. I've inherited responsibility for dozens of souls who are trapped in an endless cycle of institutional routine. Mariam left me this place because she believed someone from the family might be able to find the solution she'd spent decades searching for. A way to convince these figures that their work is finished and they can finally rest. The problem is that I'm beginning to understand their perspective too well. And the longer I stay here, the more their routines are starting to make sense to me. This morning, I found myself checking on empty rooms as if patients were still sleeping in the beds. And I've started following the same walking patterns that the nurse uses during her endless rounds. I think Mariam's real warning wasn't about the supernatural activity. It was about how easy it becomes to join the routines once you understand what everyone is trying to accomplish. If you find this journal, know that Millbrook State Hospital isn't just haunted. It's actively recruiting new staff to help maintain operations that can never truly end. The church basement had been my secret refuge for 3 months before I discovered what the congregation was really doing during their Wednesday night healing services. My name is Mackenzie, and I'd been living rough since losing my job and apartment in the spring, surviving on whatever charity I could find while avoiding the shelters that had become too dangerous for someone traveling alone. The basement of St. Matthew's Community Church offered everything I needed: a warm, dry place to sleep, access to a bathroom, and volunteers who left sandwiches and bottles of water for whoever might need them, without asking questions about my circumstances. Pastor Lionel had found me there one morning in June, but instead of calling the police or asking me to leave, he'd sat down beside my sleeping bag and talked with me about faith, hardship, and the church's mission to serve people who'd been forgotten by the rest of society. He explained that St. Matthew's had always been different from other congregations, focusing on practical charity rather than judgment, and that I was welcome to continue using the basement as long as I needed shelter. His only request was that I stay out of sight during regular church services and respect the building's sacred purpose. What made the arrangement perfect was that the church held most of its activities upstairs in the main sanctuary, leaving the basement quiet and private during the day, when I needed to rest. The only regular activity down there was the Wednesday night healing service, which Pastor Lionel described as a small group ministry where people came to pray for physical and spiritual healing. He said the meetings rarely involved more than a dozen participants and usually lasted only an hour, giving me plenty of time to slip out through the back door and return after they'd finished. For the first 2 months, this arrangement worked exactly as he described. I'd leave Wednesday evenings around 6 and return after 8 to find the basement empty, except for the lingering smell of candles and something medicinal that reminded me of a hospital. But gradually, I became curious about what actually happened during these healing services, especially when I started noticing that some of the regular participants looked increasingly frail and sick, despite supposedly receiving divine healing every week. The first clue that something was wrong came when I found medical equipment hidden in a storage closet that should have contained only cleaning supplies and Christmas decorations. There were IV bags, surgical instruments, syringes, and medications with labels that had been deliberately obscured, all stored in a way that suggested regular use rather than emergency first aid supplies. When I asked Pastor Lionel about the medical equipment, He explained that some church members had chronic conditions that required monitoring during the healing sessions, and that having basic medical supplies available was simply a precaution. But his explanation didn't account for the quantities I'd seen or the sophistication of some of the equipment, which looked more like what you'd find in a surgical suite than a church basement. I started paying closer attention to the Wednesday night participants, noting that they all seemed to be people like me. Homeless individuals, elderly people without family, and anyone else who might not be missed if they disappeared or stopped showing up to services. The healing they received appeared to be making them weaker rather than stronger. And several participants who'd been regulars when I first arrived had simply stopped coming without any explanation. One Wednesday night in August, I decided to stay hidden in the basement during the healing service to observe what was actually happening. I positioned myself in a storage room with a partially blocked view of the main basement area, watching as Pastor Lionel led a group of 8 people in what initially looked like a normal prayer circle. But as the service progressed, it became clear that the healing they were conducting had nothing to do with divine intervention and everything to do with medical procedures that were being performed without proper consent or sterile conditions. The participants weren't receiving healing. They were donating blood, bone marrow, and other biological materials that were being collected in medical containers and labeled for transport. Pastor Lionel worked with practiced efficiency, inserting IV lines and drawing precise amounts of blood, while maintaining the pretense that this was part of a spiritual healing ritual. The participants seemed docile and confused, responding to his instructions, but not appearing to fully understand what was being done to them. What made the scene truly horrifying was the realization that these people weren't willing donors. They'd been drugged with something that made them compliant and suggestible, while leaving them conscious enough to participate in the ritual aspects of the procedure. Pastor Lionel spoke to them in soothing tones about purification and sacrifice, while systematically harvesting biological materials that would clearly be sold to medical facilities or research laboratories that didn't ask questions about their sources. After the participants left that night, looking even more drained and disoriented than when they'd arrived, I watched Pastor Lionel package their donations in specialized containers that were picked up by a courier service within an hour of the session ending. The efficiency and organization of the operation made it clear that this wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a systematic business that had been operating for months or years, using the church's reputation and the vulnerability of desperate people to harvest biological materials for profit. The next morning, I tried to leave the church and find somewhere else to sleep, but discovered that Pastor Lionel had been monitoring my movements more carefully than I'd realized. He was waiting for me outside the basement door, smiling with the same pastoral warmth he'd shown during our first meeting. But his words made it clear that I'd become a problem that needed to be solved. He told me that he knew I'd watched the Wednesday service, and that people who discovered the church's special ministry had 2 choices: join the congregation as a full participant or leave town immediately and permanently. When I tried to argue that what he was doing was illegal and immoral, Pastor Lionel explained his philosophy with the calm certainty of someone who'd rationalized horror into virtue. He said that homeless people and social outcasts were dying on the streets anyway, ignored by society and abandoned by their families. So why not allow them to contribute something meaningful with their lives? The healing services gave desperate people a sense of purpose and community, while providing valuable medical materials that could help save other lives in legitimate medical settings. He told me that most of the participants never even realized what was being taken from them, experiencing the procedures as spiritual events that left them feeling blessed and chosen rather than violated. The small amounts of blood, bone marrow, and tissue he collected wouldn't kill anyone immediately, but the cumulative effect over months of participation would gradually weaken their immune systems and overall health until they died of seemingly natural causes that no medical examiner would question. That afternoon, I discovered I wasn't the first person to stumble onto the church's secret operations. There were belongings stored in the basement that clearly belonged to other homeless individuals who'd used the space as shelter. Pastor Lionel had been rotating through vulnerable people for years, offering them temporary refuge while evaluating their suitability for the healing ministry. Those who proved too curious or uncooperative simply disappeared, while those who were easily manipulated became regular participants until their health failed completely. When I demanded to know what happened to people who refused to participate or tried to expose the operation, Pastor Lionel showed me a room I hadn't known existed, hidden behind what looked like a utility panel. Inside were medical records documenting dozens of people who'd received his special kind of healing, along with photographs that showed the progressive deterioration of participants over months of sessions. The final photos in each file showed people who were clearly dead, though the accompanying paperwork indicated they'd all died of natural causes in hospitals or hospices far from the church. He explained that people who couldn't be convinced to participate voluntarily were given higher doses of the sedatives used during healing services, enough to cause heart failure or respiratory depression that would appear to be natural deaths. The church's reputation in the community provided perfect cover for these deaths, with Pastor Lionel conducting memorial services for people who'd supposedly died of addiction, exposure, or untreated medical conditions that were common among the homeless population. That night, I was scheduled to attend my first healing service as a full participant, with Pastor Lionel assuring me that the experience would help me understand the spiritual significance of the work they were doing. He said that once I'd contributed to the healing ministry myself, I'd feel the same sense of purpose and belonging that sustained the other participants, and that my doubts and fears would be replaced by the peace that came from serving a higher purpose. But as I sat in the basement waiting for the other participants to arrive, I noticed that my water bottle tasted strange, and that I was beginning to feel drowsy in a way that seemed artificial rather than natural. The other participants began filing in, moving with the same docile compliance I'd observed the week before. And I realized that I'd already been dosed with whatever substance Pastor Lionel used to make his victims cooperative. I'm writing this while I still have enough clarity to understand what's happening to me and what's about to happen to the other people in this basement. Pastor Lionel is preparing his medical equipment while leading the group in prayers about sacrifice and purification. And I can feel my ability to resist or fight back fading as the drugs take stronger effect. The healing service is about to begin, and I understand now that the only cure offered here is death disguised as divine intervention. If anyone finds this, know that St. Matthew's Community Church isn't offering sanctuary to homeless people. It's harvesting them for profit while convincing them they're participating in sacred rituals. Pastor Lionel has perfected a system that exploits the desperation of society's most vulnerable people. And the church's respected position in the community provides perfect cover for systematic murder disguised as charity work. The basement door is locked. The medical equipment is ready, and Pastor Lionel is approaching with the same gentle smile he's worn since the day he found me sleeping here. But now I can see the calculation behind his pastoral warmth and understand that his healing ministry has claimed another willing participant in the divine plan he's created to justify the unjustifiable. The sound started 3 days after we broke into the abandoned Riverside County isolation ward. But by then, it was already too late to leave. My name is Fernanda, and I'd been working as a night janitor at the county hospital for 6 months when I first heard about the old isolation building that had been sealed since 1978. According to the older staff members, it had housed patients with infectious diseases that were too dangerous for the main hospital. But funding cuts and advances in treatment had made the facility obsolete, leaving it empty and forgotten on the far side of the hospital complex. The building fascinated me because it represented everything the modern hospital tried to hide. The acknowledgement that some conditions couldn't be cured, that some patients couldn't be helped, and that sometimes the best medicine could do was contain suffering rather than eliminate it. I'd walk past it during my rounds, noting how different it looked from the rest of the hospital with its reinforced windows, multiple airlock doors, and the kind of ventilation systems designed to prevent anything from escaping rather than simply maintaining comfortable temperatures for patients and staff. My curiosity might have remained harmless if I hadn't met Jaden and Kaysen, two urban explorers who specialized in documenting abandoned medical facilities. They'd been researching the isolation ward for months, collecting architectural plans and interviewing retired hospital staff who remembered working there before it closed. According to their research, the building had been designed not just for infectious disease containment, but for housing patients whose conditions were so unusual or dangerous that conventional medical facilities couldn't handle them safely. Jaden had discovered that the isolation ward's closure coincided with a series of patient deaths that had never been fully explained in the medical records. The official reports cited complications from various experimental treatments, but retired nurses he'd interviewed described symptoms and behaviors that didn't match any known diseases. They spoke of patients who'd been admitted for routine infectious diseases, but had gradually developed conditions that defied medical understanding: accelerated aging, unexplained tissue changes, and mental deterioration that seemed to follow patterns that weren't consistent with any psychiatric or neurological conditions. Breaking into the building was easier than we'd expected, partly because the hospital administration seemed eager to forget the isolation ward existed. The exterior security was minimal, with only basic locks on doors that hadn't been maintained in decades. And once we were inside, it became clear that the building had been abandoned hastily rather than properly decommissioned. Medical equipment remained in the treatment rooms, patient files were still stored in the administrative offices, and personal belongings were scattered throughout the building as if people had simply stopped coming to work one day and never returned. The patient rooms were the most disturbing part of our initial exploration, not because of their institutional appearance, but because of the modifications that had been made to contain people who'd apparently required more than standard medical restraints. The walls were reinforced with steel plating, the windows were covered with mesh that looked more like prison barriers than safety glass, and several rooms contained restraint systems that seemed designed for people who possessed abnormal strength or mobility. The isolation protocols weren't just about preventing the spread of infection, they were about keeping patients from escaping. We'd planned to document the building over a single weekend, taking photographs and collecting any interesting artifacts before leaving and never returning. But on our second night there, we discovered that the building wasn't as abandoned as we'd believed. The sounds began around midnight. Not the settling noises or wind effects you'd expect from an empty building, but purposeful movement that suggested the presence of people who were trying to remain hidden while conducting activities they didn't want discovered. The sounds were coming from the basement levels, areas that hadn't appeared on any of the architectural plans Jaden had obtained, and that we hadn't known existed until we found the stairwells that led downward from the main treatment areas. When we investigated, we discovered that the isolation ward's basement contained facilities that had clearly never been intended for standard medical use. Rooms with specialized drainage systems, areas with industrial ventilation that suggested the processing of hazardous materials, and storage areas that contained equipment we couldn't identify, but that looked designed for procedures that went far beyond conventional treatment. The people making the sounds weren't hospital staff conducting authorized activities. They were operating the basement facilities as if the isolation ward had never been closed, continuing whatever work had been done there before the official closure. We watched from hidden positions as they moved through the basement in protective clothing that looked more appropriate for handling radioactive materials than infectious diseases, carrying containers that required special handling procedures and speaking in hushed tones about schedules and protocols that suggested an ongoing operation. What made the situation truly terrifying was the realization that these people weren't just using the abandoned building for unauthorized activities. They were continuing the same work that had been done there before the closure, working with materials and subjects that required the kind of containment protocols the isolation ward had been designed to provide. The patients who died under mysterious circumstances hadn't been victims of failed treatments. They'd been test subjects in experiments that had been moved underground when the official facility was shuttered. Over the next several days, we witnessed the arrival of new subjects, people who were brought to the basement facilities in medical transport vehicles that arrived during the early morning hours when hospital security was minimal. The subjects appeared to be homeless individuals, elderly people without family connections, and others whose disappearances wouldn't trigger immediate investigations. They were processed through the basement facilities using procedures that bore no resemblance to legitimate medical care, subjected to treatments that seemed designed to induce the same mysterious conditions that had affected the original's isolation ward patients. When we tried to leave the building to report what we'd discovered, we found that the people operating the basement facilities had been aware of our presence from the beginning and had been monitoring our movements through security systems that were far more sophisticated than anything the abandoned building should have contained. The building's apparent abandonment was a carefully maintained facade that concealed ongoing operations, and our exploration had made us witnesses to activities that couldn't be allowed to become public knowledge. Dr. Allen, the man who seemed to be in charge of the basement operations, explained that the isolation ward had never truly been closed. It had simply been moved underground to continue research that was too valuable and too dangerous to abandon. The mysterious patient deaths that had led to the official closure hadn't been treatment failures. They'd been successful experiments in accelerated human evolution, attempts to push the boundaries of what the human body could become when subjected to controlled stressors and genetic modifications. The work being conducted in the basement wasn't just continuing the original experiments. It was perfecting them, using decades of additional research to refine the processes that had killed the early test subjects. The goal was to create enhanced humans who could survive in environments that would kill normal people. Individuals who could serve as the foundation for a new kind of humanity that would be better adapted to an uncertain future where conventional human physiology might not be sufficient for survival. Dr. Allen told us that we had two choices: become willing participants in the research program, contributing our bodies to experiments that might advance human evolution, or become unwilling subjects whose participation would serve the same purpose, but with significantly more suffering involved in the process. He said that people who discovered the ongoing work were never allowed to leave, partly for security reasons, but mainly because they represented valuable research opportunities that couldn't be wasted on moral considerations about consent and human rights. The experiments being conducted weren't just medical research. They were systematic torture designed to push human subjects beyond their biological and psychological limits to see what adaptations might emerge under extreme stress. The enhanced humans being created weren't improvements on normal human beings. They were barely recognizable as human at all. Creatures that had been transformed into something that could survive conditions that would kill anyone else, but had lost most of what made them people in the process. We've been in the basement facilities for 2 weeks now. And I'm writing this during one of the brief periods when we're left unsupervised between treatment sessions. The changes that have been induced in our bodies are already noticeable. Increased tolerance for pain, altered sleep cycles, and metabolic changes that allow us to survive on minimal food and water. But we're also losing our capacity for complex thought, our ability to feel emotions beyond basic survival instincts, and our connection to the memories and relationships that once defined who we were as individuals. Jaden and Kaysen are further along in the transformation process than I am. And when I look at them now, I can barely recognize the people they used to be. They've become focused entirely on the immediate requirements of survival, responding to stimuli with the efficiency of well-trained animals, but showing no signs of the curiosity and creativity that had led them to explore abandoned buildings in the first place. The process isn't creating enhanced humans. It's creating perfectly adapted slaves who will follow orders without question because they've lost the capacity for independent thought. Dr. Allen says the transformation is nearly complete, that within another week we'll have become the kind of enhanced humans who can serve as templates for the next phase of evolution. But looking at what Jaden and Kaysen have become, I understand that what we're losing in this process is everything that makes life worth living. The isolation ward's basement isn't a research facility. It's a factory that converts human beings into biological machines that can survive anything but have no reason to want to survive. The sounds that brought us here weren't just the activities of people conducting secret research. They were the cries of test subjects who were being systematically stripped of their humanity in service of a vision of human evolution that values survival above all else. And soon, those sounds will include our own voices, calling out to whatever explorers might be curious enough to investigate this supposedly abandoned building and discover that some medical research never stops, even when it should have been shut down decades ago. The town council meeting was supposed to be about the new playground equipment, but I should have known something was wrong when every family with children under 12 showed up on the same night. My name is Hannah, and I'd been Millfield city clerk for 8 years, recording minutes for council meetings that usually attracted maybe 6 people total, mostly retirees with complaints about property taxes or street maintenance. But that Tuesday evening in September, the community center was packed with parents I recognized from school events, all sitting quietly with their hands folded while their children played in the hallway outside. Mayor Armando called the meeting to order with his usual efficiency, but there was something different about his tone that night. Something formal and final that made me pay closer attention to the agenda items than usual. The playground discussion was brief and unanimous. The council approved funding for new equipment without the usual debate about costs or placement, as if the decision had been made long before the public meeting. Then Armando announced there would be a special executive session to discuss what he called community health initiatives, and asked all non-essential personnel to leave the room. As city clerk, I was technically essential personnel, but when I moved toward my usual seat near the recording equipment, Armando suggested that this particular discussion wouldn't require formal minutes. The way he said it made it clear that I was being asked to leave despite my official role. And when I looked around the room, I noticed that the parents were all staring at me with the same expectant expression, as if they were waiting for me to make a decision that would determine whether I remained part of their community or became something else entirely. I gathered my things and left through the main door. But instead of going home, I circled around to the back of the building where I knew there was a utility room with a shared wall to the meeting hall. The old building's thin walls had always been a problem for confidential discussions, and if I positioned myself correctly near the heating vents, I could hear most of what was said in the main room. What I heard over the next hour changed everything I thought I knew about my neighbors and my town. Mayor Armando was explaining the logistics of what he called the selection process, describing how families would be notified about their participation schedule and what preparation would be required before their designated dates. The parents asked questions about timing and procedures with the matter-of-fact tone people use when discussing routine administrative matters. But their questions were about which children would be selected first, how long the process would take for each family, and whether siblings would be handled together or separately. Dr. Soren, who ran the county health department, provided what sounded like medical updates on the subjects they'd been monitoring, mentioning that several children had reached the optimal developmental stage for the procedures and that the new equipment scheduled for installation would allow them to handle multiple cases simultaneously. He spoke about the children as if they were laboratory specimens rather than human beings, discussing their physical and psychological characteristics in terms of their suitability for whatever process the town had planned for them. The most chilling part of the conversation was how completely normal it all sounded to the participants. Parents discussing the surrender of their children with the same casual concern they might show for scheduling carpools or organizing bake sales. When one mother asked about the timeline for her twin daughters, Mayor Armando consulted what sounded like a detailed schedule, explaining that younger siblings would be processed first to minimize psychological complications for the family units. As the meeting progressed, I began to understand that this wasn't a recent development, but an established system that had been operating in Millfield for years, possibly decades. The parents talked about their own experiences as children, referencing procedures they'd undergone and expressing gratitude for the opportunities those experiences had provided them. They spoke about the community's special relationship with certain government agencies and the benefits that relationship brought to families who participated fully in the program. Dr. Soren explained that the new equipment represented significant advances in efficiency and comfort, allowing them to complete the procedures with less trauma and more reliable results than previous generations had experienced. He mentioned that children processed with the new technology would retain more of their original personalities while still achieving the necessary modifications, making them more effective in their future roles while maintaining the family bonds that kept communities stable. The selection criteria weren't random. Families were chosen based on genetic markers, psychological profiles, and what Mayor Armando called community integration scores that measured how well parents had adapted to their own childhood processing. Children from families with higher scores were processed earlier and with more advanced procedures, while those from marginal families might undergo simpler modifications that served different purposes within the community structure. When the parents started discussing practical arrangements for their selected children, the conversation became even more disturbing. They talked about preparing the children psychologically for their special community service, using language that made the procedures sound like honor programs rather than whatever they actually were. Families shared strategies for making the transition easier, discussing how to explain the process in terms that would minimize resistance and maximize cooperation. I realized that every adult in Millfield had undergone these procedures as children, which explained the strange uniformity in how people thought and behaved in our town. The reason everyone seemed so agreeable and cooperative wasn't because we had an unusually harmonious community. It was because disagreement and conflict had been systematically eliminated through childhood modifications that ensured compliance with community expectations. The procedures weren't just medical. They were comprehensive alterations that affected how people processed information, formed relationships, and made decisions. The modified adults could function normally in most situations, but they were fundamentally incapable of questioning authority, challenging community decisions, or acting in ways that might disrupt the social order that had been carefully engineered through generations of childhood processing. As the meeting wound down, I heard Mayor Armando reading a list of names, children who would begin their processing the following week, starting with the youngest and most psychologically flexible candidates. The parents responded to each name with polite acknowledgement, as if he were announcing school honor roll recipients rather than children who would be subjected to procedures that would fundamentally alter who they were as human beings. When the parents started leaving the meeting, I quickly moved to my car and drove home. But I couldn't escape the realization that my own compliance and lack of questioning over the years meant I'd almost certainly undergone the same procedures as a child. My memories of childhood were fragmentary and strange, with gaps that I'd always attributed to normal forgetfulness, but that now seemed more like systematic erasure of experiences that might have made me resistant to community programming. The next morning, I called in sick to work and started researching Millfield's history, looking for records of the community programs that had been discussed at the meeting. What I found were decades of documentation about federal research initiatives, contracts with pharmaceutical companies, and grants for innovative community health programs that had used our town as a testing ground for social engineering experiments that went far beyond normal medical research. The playground equipment wasn't for recreation. It was part of a processing facility that would be integrated into the community center, designed to look like normal childhood amenities while serving as screening and preparation areas for the modification procedures. The bright, cheerful play structures would contain monitoring equipment that would evaluate children's psychological and physical development, identifying optimal timing for their individual processing schedules. I tried to warn some of the families about what I'd discovered, but their reactions confirmed that the adult modifications were designed to prevent exactly the kind of resistance I was attempting to create. They listened to my concerns with polite attention, then dismissed my warnings as stress-related paranoia, suggesting that I might benefit from speaking with Dr. Soren about anxiety management techniques that could help me feel more connected to community activities. When I insisted that the town was systematically modifying children through medical procedures disguised as community health programs, several neighbors expressed concern that I might be experiencing a psychological crisis that could affect my ability to perform my job as city clerk. They mentioned that employees in sensitive positions sometimes required additional evaluation to ensure they remained suitable for their responsibilities, and that Dr. Soren had developed excellent programs for helping community members readjust their perspectives when necessary. That evening, Mayor Armando knocked on my door with Dr. Soren and two other men I didn't recognize, all wearing the kind of professional smiles that people use when they're trying to appear friendly while delivering ultimatums. They explained that my recent behavior had raised concerns about my psychological stability, and that as someone with access to sensitive community information, I would need to undergo evaluation to determine whether I required additional processing to maintain my position in town. Dr. Soren said they developed new procedures specifically for adults who experienced integration difficulties, techniques that could help me reconnect with the community values that had been temporarily disrupted by whatever stress I'd been experiencing. The procedures were more complex than childhood modifications, but could be very effective in helping people rediscover their sense of belonging and purpose within the community structure. They gave me until the following morning to decide whether I wanted to undergo voluntary readjustment or whether they would need to implement involuntary procedures that would be less comfortable but equally effective. Mayor Armando explained that people who chose voluntary processing often retained more of their original personalities, while those who resisted usually required more comprehensive modifications that left them functional but significantly altered. I'm writing this because I understand now that Millfield isn't a real community. It's a laboratory where generations of children have been systematically modified to create a population that serves as test subjects for social engineering experiments. Every adult in town has been psychologically altered to prevent resistance, ensure cooperation, and maintain the artificial harmony that makes continued research possible. The children playing in the hallway during that town council meeting weren't there for babysitting. They were there for final evaluation before beginning their own processing, and their parents' calm acceptance wasn't the result of good parenting, but the product of modifications that had eliminated their capacity to protect their own children from harm. Tomorrow morning, I'll either submit to procedures that will eliminate my ability to resist what's happening here, or I'll become a test case for the involuntary processing techniques that ensure no one can ever expose what Millfield really is beneath its cheerful suburban facade. The motorcycle broke down exactly where I didn't want it to, on County Road 47, 15 miles from the nearest town, with nothing but abandoned farmland stretching in every direction. My name is Mariam, and I'd been riding cross-country for 3 weeks, fleeing a domestic violence situation in Nevada and trying to reach my sister's place in North Carolina before my ex-husband figured out where I was going. The Harley had been running fine until that moment, but now it wheezed and died on the side of a road that looked like it hadn't seen traffic in years. The sun was already low when I started walking, carrying my helmet and backpack while hoping to find some kind of help before darkness fell completely. After about 2 miles, I spotted lights in the distance. Not the warm glow of a house, but the harsh fluorescent brightness that suggested some kind of business or facility. As I got closer, I could make out a compound of low buildings surrounded by chain-link fencing, with signs that identified it as Garrett's Automotive Services and Guest Accommodation. The setup looked professional enough from the outside, with several service bays, a small office building, and what appeared to be a motel unit attached to the back. A man in coveralls emerged from one of the service bays as I approached, introducing himself as Garrett Wheeler and asking about my motorcycle trouble with the kind of genuine concern that made me feel like I'd found exactly the help I needed. He said he could have someone pick up my bike in the morning and that I was welcome to stay in one of their guest rooms while they worked on the repairs. The guest accommodation was simple but clean, with a comfortable bed, working bathroom, and cable television that helped distract me from worrying about my situation. Garrett explained that they served travelers who got stranded on the rural highways, providing both automotive services and temporary lodging for people who needed time to get their vehicles fixed. He said most of their guests were truckers, motorcyclists, and RV travelers who appreciated the combination of professional repair work and affordable accommodation. Over dinner that evening, I met some of the other guests. Alan, an older man whose RV had transmission problems, and Zayden, a younger guy whose car had been totaled in a deer collision. They both praised Garrett's work and hospitality, mentioning that they'd been staying at the facility for several weeks while waiting for parts or insurance settlements. The conversation was pleasant and normal, giving me no reason to suspect that I'd stumbled into anything more complicated than a rural repair shop with attached lodging. The first sign that something was wrong came the next morning when I asked about using the phone to call my sister and let her know about my delay. Garrett apologized and explained that their phone lines were down due to storm damage, but that he could drive me to town later in the day if I needed to make important calls. When I asked about cell phone service, he said the area had terrible coverage due to the surrounding hills, though he thought I might be able to get a signal from the roof of the office building if I really needed to reach someone urgently. But when I climbed onto the roof with my phone, I discovered that the cell towers that should have been visible on the horizon had been deliberately obscured by signal-blocking equipment that was clearly designed to prevent guests from making calls. The facility wasn't just isolated by geography. It was deliberately cut off from outside communication which suggested that Garrett's hospitality might serve purposes beyond simple automotive repair and traveler accommodation. That afternoon, I noticed that the other guests weren't actually free to leave whenever they wanted, despite the casual way they talked about their extended stays. Alan mentioned that he'd tried to call a taxi to take him to town, but that Garrett had explained taxi services didn't operate in the area due to insurance concerns. Zayden said he'd offered to pay a local to drive him to the nearest bus station, but had been told that strangers asking for rides were viewed with suspicion by the tight-knit rural community. When I suggested that we could walk to town together, both men looked uncomfortable and changed the subject, as if the idea of leaving the facility hadn't occurred to them or had been dismissed for reasons they didn't want to discuss. Their behavior suggested that whatever kept them at Garrett's place wasn't just mechanical problems with their vehicles, but some form of coercion or manipulation that they either didn't recognize or were afraid to acknowledge. That evening, I decided to explore the facility more thoroughly, while the staff thought I was asleep in my room. What I found confirmed my growing suspicions that Garrett's automotive services was a front for something much more sinister than roadside assistance. Behind the main service bays were additional buildings that weren't visible from the road, structures that looked like they were designed for housing people rather than repairing vehicles. The additional buildings contained dormitory-style rooms with multiple beds, communal bathrooms, and what looked like medical examination facilities that had nothing to do with automotive repair. There were charts on the walls tracking the physical condition of residents, medication schedules, and what appeared to be behavioral evaluations that treated the guests like patients or test subjects rather than customers waiting for vehicle repairs. In Garrett's office, I found files documenting dozens of stranded travelers who'd been brought to the facility over the past several years. But the paperwork suggested that most of them never left. The files contained detailed medical information, psychological profiles, and notes about each person's usefulness for various purposes that weren't clearly defined but obviously went beyond automotive services. Some files were marked as processed, while others were designated as long-term residents or specialized program participants. The most disturbing discovery was a room in the basement that contained equipment clearly designed for medical procedures, but not the kind that would be necessary for treating injuries from car accidents or mechanical mishaps. There were operating tables, anesthesia machines, and storage facilities for biological materials, all maintained in sterile condition and obviously in regular use. The facility wasn't just detaining stranded travelers. It was using them for medical purposes that required surgical procedures and long-term monitoring. When I tried to leave the building and return to my room, I found that Garrett was waiting for me in the hallway, no longer wearing the friendly expression that had made me feel welcome when I first arrived. He explained that guests who discovered the facility's extended operations had two choices: become willing participants in their specialized programs, or undergo procedures that would make them suitable for participation, whether they wanted to be involved or not. Garrett told me that the automotive repair business was legitimate, but secondary to their primary function as a procurement and processing center for medical research that required subjects who wouldn't be missed by their families or communities. Stranded travelers were ideal subjects because their isolation and transient lifestyles meant their disappearances could be easily attributed to accidents, crime, or voluntary relocation to unknown destinations. The procedures weren't necessarily fatal, but they were designed to alter people's physical and mental capacity in ways that made them suitable for research purposes, while eliminating their ability to escape or report what was being done to them. Some subjects underwent organ harvesting that was timed to coincide with their natural deaths from other causes, while others were modified to serve as long-term test subjects for pharmaceutical research or experimental medical procedures. Dr. Cassius, whom I met the next morning, explained that my particular profile made me valuable for their behavioral modification research. Studies that examined how people responded to controlled stress and psychological manipulation over extended periods. He said the research was ultimately beneficial because it contributed to understanding how to help people adapt to difficult circumstances, but that the subjects needed to be isolated from outside influences that might contaminate the experimental conditions. When I insisted that I had family who would report me missing, Dr. Cassius showed me communications equipment that allowed them to send messages from my phone and email accounts, creating the impression that I was continuing my cross-country journey while actually remaining at the facility. They had years of experience managing the digital footprints of their research subjects, maintaining the illusion that people were living normal lives in distant locations while keeping them available for ongoing studies. The other guests weren't actually waiting for vehicle repairs or insurance settlements. They were long-term research subjects who'd been conditioned to accept their situation as normal and temporary. Alan and Zayden had undergone procedures that affected their memory and decision-making capacity, leaving them functional but unable to recognize their captivity or take effective action to escape it. Over the following weeks, I watched new stranded travelers arrive at the facility, all following the same pattern that had brought me there. Mechanical problems, communication difficulties, and gradually increasing dependence on Garrett's hospitality until escape became impossible. Each new arrival was evaluated for their research potential, with some selected for immediate processing and others designated for longer observation periods before their final assignments were determined. The facility operated with the efficiency of a medical institution disguised as a roadside business, processing dozens of subjects annually while maintaining the appearance of a helpful service for travelers in distress. The remote location and carefully managed communication blackout meant that subjects could be held indefinitely without outside interference, and their gradual disappearance from their normal lives could be attributed to the natural mobility of people who live transient lifestyles. I'm writing this during one of the brief periods when I'm left unsupervised. But I understand that my situation is no different from the other long-term residents who've lost their ability to recognize their captivity. The procedures that have been performed on me over the past month have affected my memory and judgment in ways that make escape seem impossible, even when opportunities might exist. The motorcycle that broke down on County Road 47 was never actually damaged. It was disabled by equipment designed to strand travelers at predetermined locations where they could be easily collected by Garrett's operation. My mechanical problems weren't bad luck, but the result of systematic targeting that identified vulnerable travelers and created the circumstances that would deliver them to processing facilities disguised as roadside assistance. If you ever find yourself stranded on a rural highway and offered help by a facility that seems too convenient and accommodating, know that some automotive services provide more than vehicle repair, and that not all hospitality is offered with your best interests in mind. The factory closure announcement came on a Friday in October, delivered to 300 employees who'd built their lives around jobs that were about to disappear forever. My name is Angel, and I'd worked the night shift at Millfield Processing for 12 years, running quality control on the production line that had been the economic heart of our small town since the 1960s. When management announced they were moving operations to Mexico to cut labor costs, everyone knew that Millfield was about to die. Without the factory, there was nothing left to sustain a community of 1,500 people in the middle of rural nowhere. The severance packages were insulting, offering 2 weeks' pay for every year of service, along with job placement assistance that everyone knew was meaningless in an area where the factory had been the only significant employer. Most of my co-workers started making plans immediately. Younger families talked about moving to cities where manufacturing jobs still existed. Retirees discussed accelerating their Social Security claims. And everyone else tried to figure out how to survive on unemployment benefits that wouldn't cover their mortgage payments. But Ford, who'd worked in the factory's meat processing division for 20 years, had a different kind of plan, one that he shared with me and 6 other employees during what we thought would be our final shift together. He said he'd been researching alternative income sources for people with our specific skills, and that he'd found opportunities that would not only replace our factory wages, but provide significantly higher compensation for workers who were willing to adapt their techniques to new markets and products. Ford explained that our experience with meat processing, quality control, and industrial packaging made us valuable to specialized operations that served niche markets, where discretion was more important than official certification. He said there were always clients willing to pay premium prices for custom processing services, especially when those services were provided by experienced workers who understood the importance of maintaining professional standards while avoiding unnecessary paperwork or regulatory oversight. The opportunity he'd arranged was located in the abandoned Hartwell Farm Complex, 15 miles outside town, where the previous owners had left behind processing facilities that could be modified to handle specialized orders with minimal investment in new equipment. Ford said the work would be similar to what we'd done at the factory, receiving raw materials, processing them according to client specifications, packaging the finished products, and maintaining the quality standards that our reputation depended on. When I asked about the nature of these specialized products, Ford was vague but reassuring, explaining that different clients had different requirements and that we'd receive specific training for each type of work we'd be asked to perform. He said the important thing was that we had the skills and experience necessary to handle biological materials safely and efficiently, and that our years of working together as a team made us ideal for operations that required coordination and trust between workers. The first few weeks at the Hartwell facility seemed to confirm Ford's promises about the work being similar to our factory experience. We processed what Ford described as specialty meats for restaurants and private clients who paid premium prices for products that weren't available through conventional suppliers. The materials we worked with looked and felt familiar, requiring the same techniques we'd used for years, and the packaging and labeling procedures followed industrial standards that we understood completely. But gradually, I began noticing details that didn't align with normal meat processing operations. The raw materials arrived in containers that lacked the typical supplier information. The finished products were picked up by unmarked vehicles at odd hours, and several of my co-workers mentioned that some of the meat had characteristics that didn't match any livestock they'd worked with before. When I asked Ford about these inconsistencies, he explained that our clients operated in markets where discretion was essential, and that asking too many questions about sources or destinations could jeopardize the arrangements that kept us employed. He said that everyone in specialized processing learned to focus on their specific job responsibilities without concerning themselves with aspects of the business that were handled by management, and that maintaining this professional attitude was what distinguished premium services from ordinary commercial operations. The truth about our new employment became clear when I accidentally opened a container that hadn't been properly labeled, revealing contents that were unmistakably human rather than animal in origin. The realization that we'd been processing human remains rather than specialty meats hit me like a physical blow. But when I tried to discuss my discovery with the other workers, their reactions made it clear that most of them had already figured out what we were doing and had chosen to continue anyway. Ford's response to my concerns was matter-of-fact and unsympathetic. He explained that unemployed factory workers in rural communities didn't have the luxury of being particular about employment opportunities, and that people who wanted to maintain their standard of living sometimes had to accept work that involved moral compromises. He said that our clients paid premium prices precisely because they needed services that conventional businesses couldn't or wouldn't provide, and that workers who understood this reality could earn more money in a few months than they'd made in years at the factory. The human remains we were processing weren't from medical facilities or legitimate sources. They were coming from what Ford described as procurement operations that supplied materials to clients who couldn't obtain them through legal channels. Some of the remains were being prepared for organ harvesting operations. Others were processed for sale to medical schools and research facilities that didn't ask questions about documentation. And some were simply disposed of in ways that eliminated evidence of their original identities. Ford had recruited factory workers specifically because our experience with industrial processing made us efficient at handling biological materials, while our desperate economic situation made us unlikely to report activities that provided our only source of income. He said that people who'd lost everything when the factory closed were ideal employees for operations that required both skill and silence, because they understood that some opportunities came with conditions that couldn't be negotiated. When I threatened to contact the authorities about what we were doing, Ford showed me photographs and documentation that implicated every worker in the operation, evidence that would make us all accessories to whatever crimes were being committed through our processing work. He explained that people who tried to expose the operation would find themselves facing criminal charges for their participation, while those who continued working and maintained discretion would be protected by the same clients who provided our materials and our income. The other workers had already made their choice to prioritize survival over morality, accepting that economic desperation had led them to become part of a system they couldn't escape without destroying their own lives. Several of them had families depending on the income from our specialized processing work, and they'd convinced themselves that they were simply providing a service that would exist with or without their participation. Over the following months, the operation expanded to handle increasing volumes of materials, requiring us to work longer shifts and process more remains than our original clients had demanded. Ford explained that word of our efficiency and discretion had spread to other organizations that needed similar services, and that our success had made us valuable enough to command higher prices for our work. The Hartwell facility became a regional processing center that served clients throughout the surrounding states, handling materials from procurement operations that ranged from small-scale organ harvesting to large-scale disposal of evidence from various criminal enterprises. Our work was essential to a network that extended far beyond our small town, providing services that enabled activities we preferred not to think about too specifically. But the psychological toll of the work gradually destroyed the relationships and mental health that had sustained us through our years at the factory. We stopped talking about our families, stopped making plans for the future, and focused entirely on completing our daily processing quotas without thinking about the human cost of what we were doing. The money was good, but it came at the price of becoming people who could efficiently dismember human beings while discussing weekend plans and sports scores. I'm writing this because I want people to understand how economic desperation can transform ordinary workers into participants in systematic horror. When the factory closed, we thought we were facing unemployment and financial hardship. But what we actually faced was a choice between poverty and complicity in activities that no amount of money can justify. The small towns that are dying across America aren't just losing jobs and population. They're becoming recruitment centers for operations that exploit desperate people who have no other options for supporting their families. Ford and people like him understand that communities without economic alternatives will produce workers willing to do anything for steady wages, even when that work involves processing the remains of people who were probably murdered specifically to supply materials for our operations. If you find yourself in a situation where economic desperation makes illegal work seem like your only option, Remember that some choices can't be undone, and that money earned through participation in systematic evil will never be worth what you lose in the process of earning it. The factory workers who thought they were just trying to survive have become essential parts of a network that destroys lives. And there's no way back to the people we used to be before we started processing human beings like livestock. The Hartwell facility is still operating, still recruiting desperate workers from dying communities, and still serving clients who need human remains processed efficiently and quietly. Until communities find ways to provide legitimate economic opportunities for people facing unemployment and poverty, places like this will continue to exist, fed by the desperation of ordinary people who never intended to become monsters, but discovered that survival sometimes requires monstrous compromises. What happens when entire communities run out of choices? When economic collapse leaves people with no options except work that destroys their humanity along with their victims? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And remember to subscribe to Verified Fears for more disturbing true stories that reveal the horror hidden beneath America's forgotten towns. What would you do if desperation forced you to choose between poverty and participating in systematic evil? The line between survival and complicity might be thinner than you think.